Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. A statement by African ambassadors in India has called the attack on Africans in Greater Noida xenophobic and racial. It says sufficient deterrent measures have not been taken by the Indian government, and it calls for an independent investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Council and a comprehensive report to the African Union Commission. In response, the Ministry of External Affairs has issued a statement saying the use of the phrase xenophobic and racial was unfortunate. The ministry said strong Indian institutions are adequate to deal with what it calls aberrations. These developments suggest India's Africa policy has suffered a serious setback. So tonight we ask, is India's reluctance to call the attacks racist understandable or a cover-up? Have the African ambassadors overreacted? Are they united, or is this the work of a minority? And how is this situation to be salvaged before it becomes a crisis? My guests are two former diplomats with great experience of Africa, former High Commissioner to Nigeria and Zambia and former Foreign Secretary Krishnan Srinivasan, former High Commissioner to Namibia and South Africa Shiv Mukherjee, a member of the BJP's National Executive Sheshadri Chari, one of India's foremost sociologists Dipankar Gupta, and the President of the Association of African Students in India, Samuel Jack. Mr. Jack, let's start with the press release issued by the heads of African missions dated March the 31st, but made public yesterday. Can you explain why African ambassadors collectively felt a need to issue this unprecedented statement, which is sharply critical of the Indian government's response to recent attacks on African students?
Actually, first of all, I commend the effort by the ambassadors and deans, heads of mission. On the 31st of May 2016, if you recall, the unfortunate death of the Congolese teacher, Mr. Olivia, we had a discussion with the Minister of External Affairs along with the Justice Secretary. We had 6-point plan we had laid on how to tackle these issues and to prevent further reoccurrence. But these were not done because in Pan-India, it was only done just briefly in Delhi. In fact, most of the situations and experiences which Africans experience in these countries day to day with regards to accommodation, FRO, and in fact, I think that, this time around we have held a lot of meetings with Indian institutions, in conferences, in seminars. We're talking about these issues, but there seems to not be any solutions. We have reported severally to the dean. He has a detailed report of what is happening with regards to African students. And it's so disheartening to see what is going on when we all have a common colonial history and the non-alignment movement and all things that have been done within India and Africa.
So, Mr. Jack, can I then assume that the African heads of mission issued this unprecedented statement because they were A, frustrated by the poor response, and B, they were running out of patience? This, in a sense, is a sign of their anxiety and desperation.
Yeah, sure. Because we have reported this matter severally on different occasions and meetings with them. And I think each individual embassy has an experience.
Now, Krishnan Srinivasan, before we come to the Indian government's response, and I will come to that, I want to discuss the statement issued by the African ambassadors. It was issued after a special meeting. It's about both the recent attacks on students in Greater Noida as well as earlier attacks elsewhere in India. And it says, and I'm quoting, the meeting unanimously agreed that those accumulated attacks against Africans are xenophobic and racial in nature, and it concludes thereafter that no known, sufficient and visible deterring measures were taken by the government of India. Now, as a former foreign secretary and someone who served as High Commissioner in Nigeria and Zambia, would you agree that this is not just an unprecedented step, but it is also a very sharp critique of the Indian government?
Yes, I would agree with that. When you consider that there are perhaps some 40 or 50,000 persons from the African continent in India, and we have such a small number relatively compared to the total population, and yet we've had this problem recently, we had problems last year, we had problems the year before, all with ladies and gentlemen from Africa as the victims. Clearly something is extremely wrong and requires introspection on the part of every Indian. As far as the African ambassador's statement is concerned, well, where are the African ladies and gentlemen in India to go? They can't go to the Commission on Human Rights, they can't go to the Commission on Minorities, they can't go to members of Parliament. Their only recourse, as indeed would be the same for our citizens abroad, is to go to their mission. And I think with just and due cause, I think that the African ambassadors have issued a statement which is completely warranted.
Shiv Mukherjee, African heads of mission have said that they expect strong condemnation from the highest political level, both nationally and locally, of the government of India. They also want an independent investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and they want this matter to be comprehensively reported to the African Union Commission. In other words, they are not only upset by the silence at the very top in India, but they clearly want to internationalize the attacks. How do you respond to that?
Well, I can fully understand their angst, actually. I have dealt with the problems faced by African students directly. As Director General of ICCR, we issue thousands of scholarships, mainly to African students, and looking after their welfare as part of the work. The fact is that, look, to get to the real problem, this is a society which is very often pervasively racist, based on color. Now, the other side of the picture is that the policies of the Indian government, the constitution, the policies and civil society and so on, is not racist. In fact, it raises its voice against racism. But the fact is, African students, leave this incident alone, African students day in and day out face racist situations, sniggers, catcalls, calls of Hapshi and so on. The Northeasterners face the same thing, but African students face it more. So this is first of all, this is a cumulative thing among the students, and they must have presented it, they always will present it to their heads of missions here, to their embassies here very strongly. At the same time, when an incident like this happens, the Foreign Office of Nigeria, for instance, will insist that its ambassador take it up at the highest level. I do not agree with their statement that there's no, condemnation, no adequate condemnation from the Indian side, except for one thing. Although the Foreign Minister has made a detailed statement, although the Parliament has discussed it, there has been no word from the Prime Minister. And at a time like this, I mean, he tweets on everything under the sun. Surely he could have issued a statement condemning this, because a statement from the head of government stands on a very different footing. Exactly as when the Indian was shot in Kansas, everybody here was clamoring for a statement from the President of the United States, and the clamor stopped only when Donald Trump referred to that in his speech to the Congress.
That's a very fair point.
Yes,
it's a very. I'm going to stop you, Shiv Mukherjee.
I do think
it's a very fair point you make.
Should have issued a statement.
It's a very fair point you make about how we clamored for Donald Trump to speak out when the Indian was shot in Kansas, and how, in contrast, in comparison, the Prime Minister is, forgive my phrase, deafeningly silent when Nigerians are attacked and brutally injured in India. But I'll come to that in a moment's time. I definitely will, I promise you. First, Mr. Chari, I want to take up the issue that is perhaps at the heart of the African heads of mission statement, the assertion that the attacks on African students are xenophobic and racial, and they are not just unexplained, unfortunate criminal acts. Do you accept that we've had a series of racist attacks, and this is the most recent, or do you dispute that and disagree?
No, I don't accept. No, I totally disagree with this kind of statement, and coming that too from a very responsible organization. I don't think these attacks are either xenophobic or racial. These are very isolated attacks, and every such attack that has taken place in the country, wherever it was, there is a trigger. Every attack is different, and every attack has a different trigger. It is very localized, extremely localized. None of these attacks have any relationship with one another, and when you look at these incidents, They are very isolated incidents.
Okay.
Therefore, I don't think it is very wrong to accuse the Indian population or India or the government of India or the Constitution of India as being either xenophobic or racial.
Okay.
These are very, very strong words, totally unacceptable and very unfortunate way of looking at these isolated incidents.
All right. Let me stop you there.
I
Mr.
should
Charlie,
add
you've answered very
that these
fully.
incidents
I'm going to
are
bring in
avoidable, they
Dipankar
should be
Gupta,
avoided.
who is a highly regarded sociologist, arguably India's best known and most famous. Dipankar Gupta, first of all, at the press conference the MEA spokesman held a few days ago, he refused to accept that the Greater Noida attack was racial. Then last night, the Ministry of External Affairs issued a statement, and this is what it said. It is unfortunate a criminal act has been termed as xenophobic and racial. Now, many people I know readily accept that these are racial attacks. You've just heard Shiv Mukherjee and Krishnan Srinivasan say so in so many words, and people like them are dismayed by the Indian government's reluctance or refusal to accept this. As one of India's top sociologists, I'm going to ask you two twin-related questions. Do you believe what happened in Greater Noida and what's happened earlier in Bangalore, in Chhatarpur, was racial, a racist attack? And secondly, is the Indian government's refusal an ostrich-like act of denial?
Well, I have no doubt that they were racial attacks because, yes, the provocation can be local, but the mobilizing factor is a kind of racial prejudice against some people. This does not mean that all of India is racist. It's far from true. That doesn't mean our constitution is racist, not at all. But individuals are racist, and there are individuals across the world who are racist, and individuals who are racist attack people of other races selectively and in isolation. And it's not as if the Ku Klux Klan is riding again. These attacks are not part of a large-scale mobilization in most cases. Look at the Indian attack against Indians in America. Now, the question of condemning them as xenophobic and racist is, I think, quite understandable given what these people have been through. But I must also raise the other issue. That is, in India, we don't have a law against racism. We have laws against attacks on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, against communalism, but we have nothing against racism, which is a pity. I think we should have a law against racism
but we'll come
or
to that
against
separately.
racist crimes,
Dipankar Gupta,
which will then make it possible
let's not
for us.
veer off in that direction. Let's come back to the second question I asked you. What do you make of the Indian government's or Indian spokesman's ostrich-like refusal to accept that this is a racist attack?
Well, obviously they are in denial that that's why they say it is not a racist attack. But my point simply is this, which is why I was saying that even if they were to say it's a racist attack, where is the law? So you must also have a law in place.
Quite right, but
very
you'll
similar
only,
to the one we have against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes.
A law will only come into place once the government
communalism.
accepts racist attacks happen, because then they're accepting the need for the law. But as long as they refuse to accept racist attacks happen, they won't come around to think of a law. But let me bring in Samuel Jack, because in a very real sense, Samuel Jack, you represent the very people we are talking about. I'm bringing in Samuel Jack at this point because he represents in a very real sense the people are talking about. And I'm going to ask you, Mr. Jack, a personal question, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. Do you feel racial discrimination and prejudice when you meet Indians? And please answer honestly.
Yeah, I've experienced it in JNU, for instance, where a professor was calling me a monkey, that this is not a country of monkeys, and I had to respond immediately. And I've had it on several occasions on street aggression. Sometimes you just pass by and people throw things at you. They call you Terry Monkey Chut, Benjo, Chori. They call you all sorts of names. And these are the kind of experience which we have as Africans, you know. And the fact that you are an African and you have a neighbor, you cannot interact with your neighbor. The neighbor sees you as a threat. In fact, there are a lot of ways to look at it in different angles, you know. And let me just say one thing. You know, there are a lot of things which you share commonly as as both continents. You know, during the indented labor, over 3.5 million Indians are in countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho, and other countries. Likewise, many Africans immigrants who are in Calcutta today and in Gujarat, the Sindhis. Look at the hypocrisy of the Indian government. These people are only known for Olympics here. Only time they want people to come and participate in sports, then they bring them. They live in isolated communities.
The line is breaking up, Mr. Jack. It's not a clear line, but I want to confirm the things you said at the beginning because I think it's important. The audience should get confirmation. A professor at JNU has called you a monkey. You've had things thrown at you. Your neighbors at JNU refuse to interact with you. Am I correct on those three things? Just give me a simple yes because the line is poor.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that neighbors, not in JNU, but neighbors in apartments where African live. Myself, I don't interact with my neighbor. We don't talk.
And also you've also said that a professor at JNU has called you a monkey.
Hello?
You also said a professor at JNU has called you a monkey.
Yeah, sure, it is.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. I appreciate your honesty. Krishnan Srinivasan, you've served as High Commissioner in Nigeria and Zambia. You've also been Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth and Foreign Secretary. Are Indians racist in their attitudes to African? And has that been the position of the African people you met in Nigeria and Zambia when you were High Commissioner in those countries?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it's far too general in nature. I think that there's a certain degree of prejudice which is hardwired in Indian society. We all know about it. It's not worth really repeating that there's all kinds of many layers of discrimination in this country, whether it's region, gender, race, religion, etc. So I think that that's
how
really
do
not
Africans view Indians? Do Africans believe we are racist, and do we tend to be more racist in their country because we're less sophisticated about it than perhaps the whites?
Well, I think that very few Africans will condemn Indians in their own countries as being racist, because the Indians in their countries make it their business to get along with Africans as best they can in business and society and commerce. So that would be a difficult thing, but I think deep down the Africans, alas, have suffered from intense racism, first by the Arabs, second by the Europeans, and thirdly to a considerable extent by Indians, especially under the colonial regime.
Okay, Mr. Chari, I want to bring you. I'm stopping you, Krishnan Srinivasan, because I think you made a point that Mr. Chari should respond to. Mr. Chari, you refuse to accept that Indians are racist. You've just heard first Samuel Jack say that even a professor at JNU has called him a monkey. You've heard him say that he has things thrown at him. You've heard him say that his neighbors, whether inside or outside JNU, won't even interact with them. And you've heard Krishnan Srinivasan say that Indians are often believed by Africans to be racist in their manner and behavior. And Shiv Mukherjee said the same thing. And those are Indian high commissioners in countries like Zambia, Nigeria, South Africa and Namibia. Do you still insist on your position that we're not racist?
Absolutely, I stand by what I said. One single professor in JNU does not represent India. He does not represent Indian academia. He does not represent anything in India. Although I am very sorry that one single professor in JNU should have said these things to my African friend. But this is not representative character of India at all. A. B. Let me also tell you, I have worked in South Sudan for 3 years. The kind of animosity that I have seen towards the Arabs, the kind of animosity that I have seen towards the white men, this kind of animosity I have never seen as far as the Indians are concerned. The African community in general accepts Indians as their friends, and similarly the same kind of tendency appears to be seen in India also. But let me also add very quickly here that not all the Africans from all the African countries who come to India are students. Some of them are tourists, and some of the tourists are known to have indulged in activities which are not permitted by the Constitution of India.
Can I
They
also
have been
point out
doing
to you,
some
Mr.
illegal
Chari,
activities,
that
and
Indians are
these
known to have indulged in
activities have been
activities
reflecting.
abroad that are not
Therefore-
permitted by
therefore,
either the
to
law or
turn
the
the entire
constitution of
Indian
those countries.
community-
Indians are as liable to be criminal in their activities when they go abroad as Africans are when they come to India. You can make that point with equal credibility and equal vehemence about both.
Certainly.
So let's not bring that up.
If there is a law and order situation,
So let's not bring that up, sir. Let's not bring
if
that
there
up.
is a law and order situation, it should be seen only in the light of law and order and not as a racist activity at all.
But the question
so I
is-
strongly object to this use of word racism. This is a law and order question.
All right, let me
This is a law and
come back
order
to that.
question.
You keep insisting this is not racism, this is a law and order question. I want to bring in Shiv Mukherjee on that particular point.
No, not at all.
Let me bring in Shiv Mukherjee. Shiv Mukherjee, the MEA statement issued last night calls the attack on Africans in Greater Noida, and I'm quoting, a criminal act triggered following the untimely death of a young student under suspicious circumstances. First of all, is it right and proper to link what happened to the Nigerians in Greater Noida with this untimely death of a young student? And because in a sense, when you do link it, you're trying to suggest by implication a justification. And my second question is an even more important question. The MEA statement deliberately fails to mention that the 5 Nigerian students initially arrested in connection with the Indian student's death were then released by the police because no evidence was found to link them to the crime. Yet that critical point, which I would say is extremely germane, is missing from the MEA statement. And these are statements issued by your former colleagues. How do you respond to this? A, the linkage, and B, the failure to mention that the Nigerian students initially arrested were released because no evidence was found whatsoever.
Well, let me try and put this in perspective, Karan. As far as the MEA's resistance to be for India's to be labeled as racist is concerned, I can explain that. It has been a cardinal article of faith in our foreign policy interactions and in our interactions with the world at large that we were and remain the champions against racism, that we were the strongest supporters against racism and colonialism and were the strongest supporters of liberation movements in Africa. I'll give you a concrete example. For instance, when there was a world conference, when I was High Commissioner in South Africa, when there was a world conference on focusing on racism and xenophobia in South Africa, we were under attack for the caste system
but
in
I'm going
India,
to interrupt you,
which was
Mr.
to be
Mukherjee,
equated,
because that is our perception of
trying to be
ourselves,
equated with
and that may
racism.
be the policy we follow,
Let me
but the
complete. This is
behavior of our
relevant.
countrymen is often very different. Let's not get into those explanations. I understand
No,
that
that's
the
exactly
MEA
what I'm coming
is
to.
hooked
I am
upon
trying
its
to
image
explain to you
and therefore
why the
can't
Foreign
accept the
Office
reality.
said what it did. The fact is that there is, yes, the reality is different. The reality is, and if we deny and go into denial on these things, then we'll never be able to solve the problem. The fact is that these reactions have an underpinning of racism. No matter what the spokesman says in defense of India's position, fair enough, let that stand on its own feet. But the fact is, if we are going to try and so that we do face with African students in India, then the fact is that we will not be able to change the attitudes of society.
What about
society in India is
Mr. Mukherjee,
racist.
time is of the essence. What about the second point I made? The fact that the spokesman
in the campuses,
Mr. Mukherjee, what about the second point?
Mr. Mukherjee,
please.
by civil society and by government.
Time is
like
of the
I
essence.
said,
I can't let you go on.
Condemning this
Mr. Mukherjee, listen to me.
unequivocally, without being defensive, and in specific incidents like this, at the level of the Prime Minister himself.
Mr. Mukherjee, what about the second issue I raised? That A, the spokesman has deliberately tried to link what happened to the Nigerians in Greater Noida with the so-called suspicious death of a young student, without mentioning the critical fact that the 5 Nigerian students who were initially arrested in that connection were released by the police because there was no evidence found. And let me now add something else. Abhinandan Singh the additional superintendent of police in Greater Noida has told the New York Times, please mark that, the New York Times on the 29th of March, that no evidence that any Africans were involved in the death of the young student has been found, or even that the young student died of a drug overdose. Yet all of that is missing from the MEA statement. Please address that. Oh, I'm told we've lost Mr. Mukherjee. Krishnan Srinivasan, I hope you heard that question. Will you address it?
I think the response of the MEA spokesman was really very insensitive. I think that, yes, it may be the government line to deny that India is racist in any manner whatsoever, that we're a leading champion against racism. But this is a situation that calls for a different approach altogether. Extremely insensitive to cast doubt on the ambassador's statement. It's insensitive also not to give the reality of the situation, which, as you mentioned, was revealed by the police officer in charge of this investigation, presumably.
Okay.
And I'd like to mention one other thing, incidentally,
quickly,
which is relevant here. That is that I believe when the mob supporting the dead student came to, well, he wasn't dead at the time; he was missing. Came to the apartment of the African students. The first thing they did was to examine the refrigerator. So the media says, and that was outrageous because it implied.
Let me bring in Dipankar Gupta. I want to take up the other point made by Shiv Mukherjee earlier. Sadly, we've lost the line to Mr. Mukherjee. The moment will come back. The African heads of mission have called for the highest political level of condemnation. And that, in a sense, was echoed by Shiv Mukherjee, who said that we in India clamored for Donald Trump to speak out when the Indian got shot and killed in Kansas. Yet when something happens to Nigerian students in India and African students repeatedly, the Prime Minister is deafeningly silent. Now, it is true, and it's only fair I point this out, that the MEA called the incident when it happened deplorable. It's also true that MJ Akbar, the junior foreign minister, spoke directly to the acting Nigerian High Commissioner. But on this specific issue, because of its high profile and because of its racist character, is there a need, as Shiv Mukherjee said, for the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister of UP to themselves speak out? Or is that exaggerated and unwarranted?
There's no doubt that the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister speak out, it'll have a terrific influence, especially on those who've been attacked. They'll feel so much more reassured. In fact, I remember when there was this attack against Jewish people in France, the President led the demonstration against such attacks. So there is a huge symbolic effect when the head of state or the Chief Minister comes forward and makes a point. This, however, does not mean that we can just make statements and get away with it, which is why I keep insisting we must have proper laws against racism, a fact that nobody seems to take seriously. Unless you have laws against racism, there's no point in making statements. They don't really count.
Okay.
And I'm insistent on that point because I know in America, laws against racism really went a long way in curbing racism from what it used to be. And unless we are able to do that here, we should still be, arguing this issue again and again, and such matters will come up.
Can I ask you one more question and ask you for a quick answer, Dipankar Gupta? Was the Prime Minister's silence acceptable and understandable? Or given that he tweets on a million subjects, given that this critically affects his Africa policy, which is a cardinal element of his foreign policy, and given that this affects actual human beings who suffered in India, should he have spoken out? Give me a short answer to that.
I think he should have. I mean, I said so. I said so earlier. It would have made a great difference if he had spoken out, and he should have spoken out on this matter, and he should have spoken out earlier as well.
Okay.
And that is true. There's no doubt about it. But I don't want to be slave to the fetish of statements.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's stop there. I want to bring in Samuel Jack, who's now being studio. I'm grateful you've been able to come earlier. You've been stuck in traffic, but you're here with us. According to today's Times of India, sources in the MEA have said to that paper that only a very small number of African heads of mission have been consulted before this statement or press release was issued. The suggestion is that African countries have not spoken in one voice, but that the Eritrean ambassador, who is the dean of the African heads of mission, has issued the statement after meeting with only a few ambassadors. And the paper says, and I'm quoting, some prominent heads of mission deny attending the meeting or being consulted. Is this a statement just from a minority of African heads of mission? Is there some sort of sense in which maybe this is a personal campaign of the Eritrean ambassador?
For that, I cannot comment on this because the high commissions and the ambassadors are very sensitive about this issue. I cannot comment if it's unanimous or not. That I cannot comment. I'll leave it to their own judgment, and I cannot say anything regarding that because...
Can I ask you this? Do you have any reason to believe it may not be unanimous?
I don't have it. I believe it's unanimous, and I believe that these things are coming directly from the ambassadors because we as students on our daily life, we have had issues which we have reported directly to them, and we as an association are directly under them.
Can I ask you one other question?
I'll just make a correction.
Do you know of any African ambassador that might not have been in agreement with the statement?
I cannot say.
But you don't know of any?
I cannot comment on that. What I just want to make one correction. The correction is that, you know, I don't live in JNU. I live in Vasantve at C Block, and I don't communicate with my neighbors. We don't even talk.
Even in Vasantve C Block, and I live in that part of Delhi, your neighbors don't communicate with you?
We don't communicate. We don't talk to each other.
And this is because you're black and African?
Yeah, I think so. And this is sentiment that is, you know, propagated by many African students. And in fact, this is the reality on the ground.
So the common experience of African students is that they're isolated, Indians don't mix with them.
Yeah, not isolated Indians. I mean, the community in general, their perceptions, you know, and assumptions and theories about African students and African in general. And these have manifested with regards to accusing people of cannibalism, which is very wrong. You know,
have you ever been accused of cannibalism yourself?
I've never.
But you know people who have.
I know people, and in some cases, you know, in schools, we have friends, but you know, actually, they don't come to visit us. They don't get to know us. So my own point is, if this is the fact, you know, that means this country is racist.
Absolutely. I'm grateful that you're honest in saying it. I hope people listen and pay heed. Krishnan Srinivasan, where does this whole cumulative development leave India's outreach to Africa? In 2015 October, India held a major Heads of African Governments conference. It was deemed a success. Last year, the President, the Vice President and the Prime Minister visited Africa. Each of them visited some 3 or 4 countries. Where does all of that stand after this angry statement from the African heads of mission and the terse response and probably this less than satisfactory response from the MEA spokesman?
Yes, of course. I think the whole thing could have been handled much better, and it is to be hoped that measures will be taken to prevent this kind of attack and this kind of discrimination manifesting itself in future. As far as the relations with Africa are concerned, you're right that Mr. Modi has placed a great emphasis on this, and I think we have a trade relationship which is about $50 billion, and also Indian investments of about the same level in Africa. So this is a very, very tremendous improvement on, let's say, what has happened over the last 10 years or so. So I think that we've got this many-layered interaction with African countries. We have about 3 million persons.
So where does it all stand today? Has it suffered a setback?
And I think that we have to note, I think, that the relations between African countries and India are fundamentally on the basis of mutual interest.
Okay.
And I think they cannot be rocked permanently by incidents, however regrettable, that affect relatively small members of the African community in India, however deplorable those incidents may be.
That's a very reassuring answer. I'm going to Mr. Chari now because I'm running out of time. That's a very reassuring answer. But Mr. Chari, would you accept that even if the fundamentals of the relationship, as Krishnan Srinivasan says, will not be affected, the image of the country, the image of the Prime Minister perhaps has been damaged, that this is not the way India wants to be seen in Africa, and yet, unfortunately, this is precisely the sort of image that's now getting spread.
No, not at all. I don't think the image of the Prime Minister has been damaged in any way whatsoever. Especially after the Foreign Minister of the country, the highest authority as far as our foreign policy is concerned, has spoken out anywhere, not anywhere else, but on the floor of the House. And she has unequivocally condemned this incident. She has also said that at the highest level we are looking into this incident, number one. Number two, the police department has already absolved all these people of any crime or whatever it is. It has been a very local incident, and we have already convinced the diplomatic community that this is a local incident, and the majority of the heads of state in the African countries, almost 54 to 55 countries, and also the people and the diplomatic people in those countries know very well that India is not a racist country.
Now forgive me, sir.
India is open to
I hear what you're saying, and I accept what you're saying as something that is your own sincere opinion. But we cannot have convinced the diplomats if the African heads of mission together collectively issue that statement calling it xenophobic and racist. And secondly, to talking about the silence at the very top.
No.
And thirdly, saying that there's been no sufficient
this is not a general opinion.
Measure.
I don't think this
They
is
are
a general
convinced.
opinion of the African countries.
Sorry? Those are the African
This
countries.
is not a general opinion of the African nations. This is not the general opinion. No, I
are
don't
you saying
think
that
this
the
is a general
Eritrean
opinion.
ambassador has somehow
However,
misled
whatever
us?
opinion they have expressed,
Are you saying
is
the
very
Eritrean ambassador has
unfortunate.
misled us? So this is a statement issued on letterhead of the heads of mission.
I'm not saying that, but this is not the opinion of the heads of the states in the African countries.
How do you know?
Absolutely
How do you
unwarranted,
know?
very unfortunate
How do
statement.
you know?
This is a very unwarranted and very unfortunate statement. I would appeal to the Dean of the African countries to go and study the situation and come to a proper conclusion. He should have concluded before issuing such a statement. It is very unfortunate, but I am sure such statements will not affect India's interest in African countries,
Okay.
and we will be able to deal with the African countries just as we were able to deal before.
Shiv Mukherjee, the African heads of mission have wanted this issue of the attacks on Africans in India raised A, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and B, they've also asked for the matter to be comprehensively reported to the African Union Commission. Clearly, they want to internationalize the issue. Is there a danger that in the process you might begin to see some sort of backlash on the very large Indian diaspora in several African countries, Nigeria, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, you name it, South Africa? Is there a danger of a backlash on them?
I sincerely hope not, and I doubt it. There's a lot of sense in the ruling establishments of most African countries. They've dealt with similar situations before within their own countries vis-a-vis the Indian community. I don't think there's a danger. As far as the UN is concerned, it was in response to a question, the Secretary General spokesman had said that, look, we don't know if the UN is involved in this, and we hope the culprits will be brought to book. Fair enough. I doubt if there's any danger of this being internationalized. What I would say in conclusion, I would agree completely with my former boss, Mr. Srinivasan. Both of us have served for long years in Africa. Listen, even if what Mr. Chari is saying is right, that these are isolated incidents and not at all indicative of exactly where India stands, and our great record on an inclusive, open society and so on. Even if the statement of the African ambassadors, regardless of how many attended that meeting, was an overreaction, this is a classic case of where the perception is more important than the nitty-gritty of the realities of this or that fact. This kind of situation, especially I would say in a country like Nigeria, the most populous in Africa, will be blown out of all proportion in the press They are not going to look at each and every aspect of that. The spokesman's statement, I agree completely with Mr. Srinivasan, could have been much more sensitive.
Okay.
I don't know what briefing he was given, but we had two choices. One, the choice that was adopted, which was a shrill denial of everything the African ambassador said, and a very defensive, but a strongly defensive statement, which poured scorn on that statement, and in fact subsequently leaked various things about this being a very badly attended meeting, and look at that Kenyan woman whose statement was a lie, and so on. The other choice was to remember that this is a continent that just 40, 50 years ago has emerged into independence and being liberated from the most oppressive forms of slavery.
Okay.
We were the champions of their decolonization. We need to maintain that relationship with them. We need to deal with them with sensitivity. I am sure that the talent we have in MEA could have drafted a statement which would have been much more sensitive, which would have allayed their apprehensions, which would have also given our ambassadors there, who will be faced with this problem, enough ammunition to work on in their outreach.
Very sadly, Mr. Mukherjee, we didn't use that talent to the best effect we could have. Unfortunately, we came up with the worst possible statement rather than the best. Let me bring in Dipankar Gupta. Dipankar Gupta, the attack on African students and India's response has been in several major Western papers over the last few days. It's been in the BBC, it's been in the New York Times, it's been in the Financial Times, and then today, the United Nations Secretary General spokesman actually said this: "We do very much hope that people who are responsible for the attacks are brought to justice," which clearly by implication suggests that they might not be, or that the efforts to bring them are not sufficient and serious. Do you fear that this is damaging India's standing internationally, not just in Africa?
Well, I have no doubt that it does damage India's standing, and that if an impression has gone around that India is a racist country, it's very, very sad, because I don't think that many of us are racists. At the same time, we should pay attention to the fact that many African students here do feel very insecure. So regardless of whether or not some people are brought to book for attacking Africans, we have to take care of this prejudice that's amongst us, and there has to be some kind of way of dealing with it. I don't think that we should be blown away by considerations of economic cooperation with Africa and India. I don't care whether that happens or doesn't happen, because money cannot smell, is unmusical, it is colorblind. But the more important thing here is, how do we treat people who come to our country? I think that speaks for the kind of civilizational depth we have, and that is where we should concentrate our attention on.
We have, Mr. Jack, only about a minute left. This is the last question on this show. How do you and other African students like you, other African people living in India, now feel when you live in this country? Do you feel welcome? Do you want to stay on? Are you apprehensive, and are you thinking of leaving?
The most important thing is acceptance in any society. Anywhere you go, if you are accepted in the community and in that society, then you'll be able to live and do whatever you want to do. But you live in a society where you're not accepted, there is always an aggression, there is always a motive, to abuse you, to make you feel uncomfortable. I think there's no need for you to come.
So you don't feel accepted?
Yeah, we don't feel accepted, and I think we don't feel welcome in this country. And for me, after my studies, I'll just go home and never come to India.
You will never come to India?
Yes.
In other words, you are waiting to leave India?
Yes, after my studies.
This has been an unhappy time for you?
Yeah, it has been much of a sad experience which I've had. In fact, most especially, street aggressions on the road where you walk, and people just abuse you and call you a sort of name. And, you try to talk to them, and you go to the police station, the case turns against you because you're a foreigner. What right do you have over?
So when you return home, you will be disillusioned about India?
Of course I will. Of course I will.
I hope people are listening and they take to heart what you said.
Sure.
Because I have to say, it is a heartrendingly horrible thing to hear that someone who came to my country as a guest, expected the best, leaves disillusioned, feels unwanted, and can't wait to get away. I'm very sorry that you've had this experience. But I'm grateful that you have been open and honest in sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
This is a very sad episode that we entertain. It's one that unfortunately we've had to do many times in the last few years. I hope we never have to repeat this sort of episode ever again. I think we have to accept that we are at times, not all of us, not all the time, but some of us, and sometimes quite often, can be deeply racist. And we will only change if we accept it. And we'll only get that law that Dipankar Gupta talks about if we accept that there's a need for it. And that means we have to accept that we can be at times horribly racist. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. Goodbye, good night.